You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
So at some point, I decided, you know what, why don't I go learn how the businesses that do survive still end up surviving? It became clear to me that the biggest problem to try to solve is to create platforms for other entrepreneurs who wanted to solve real problems and don't have access to the right resources. We invest in startups across all sectors, across the continent at the earliest stage of institutional investing. How do we create platforms where investors and entrepreneurs can essentially speak the same language and just like bridge that gap? So I believe startups have a critical role to play in economic development on the continent going forward.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have another special guest, Emmanuel Adegboye, who is the head of Madika, which is an Africa-focused pre-seed investment program empowering underrepresented and underfunded mission-driven founders on the continent. Welcome to the podcast, Emmanuel. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much, Tessa. It's a privilege to be here.
And it's a privilege to have you on the podcast. We always start from the beginning, so introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Emmanuel.
Sure, thanks. My name is Emmanuel Adegboye. The running thread in my career has been trying to figure out ways to leverage technology to solve Africa's biggest challenges. So I'm really motivated by Africa's potential, and I do want to play a part in that. But my path has kind of changed at different points in my life. I kind of thought I was going to be a researcher early on in my career. I did my bachelor's in engineering physics, did a postgraduate diploma in remote sensing and GIS, and then went on to do a master's in environmental control and management. I thought I was going to, move on from there into a PhD, focus on space applications still for environmental management. But at some point, I realized that maybe research wasn't going to be the best way for me to achieve my objectives, because there are challenges in the educational sector, especially in Nigeria, and I didn't feel like I was solving like real problems. So at some point, I decided, you know what? Yeah, everyone says it's tough to do business in Nigeria. Why don't I go learn how the businesses that do survive still end up surviving? And that kind of essentially shifted my focus towards the tech ecosystem, given my background in tech in some ways. And the motivation was just to learn as much as I can. Hopefully that would make me a better researcher. But in the course of being in the startup ecosystem, trying to launch a startup of my own, by the way, and realizing how hard it was, it became clear to me that maybe the biggest problem to try to solve is to create platforms for other entrepreneurs who like me, wanted to solve real problems and don't have access to the right resources. And that has kind of informed my career over the last decade or so. I've been building communities of entrepreneurs. I've been designing entrepreneur support programs. I've been otherwise lobbying for policies to support entrepreneurs. I've kind of moved around throughout the early stage entrepreneurship value chain, so to speak. And I've experienced all the different parts of it. And that's kind of my journey in a nutshell.
You've given us great insight into who you are in terms of figuring out ways to leverage technology to achieve Africa's potential, and also your early career and your journey into what it is that you do, which we are going to get into. You're the head of Madika. Tell us a bit more about the company and what you're currently doing in Africa and what you hope to achieve.
Yeah, sure. As you mentioned, Madika, first is short for Made in Africa. And as you mentioned, is a sector-agnostic, Africa-focused pre-seed investment program. And the aim is to democratize access to funding and world-class company building support for underrepresented and underfunded mission-driven founders on the continent. But what that means in essence is that we invest in startups across all sectors, across the continent at the earliest stage of institutional investing. We invest up to $200,000 upfront, and then work with the founders over a 12 to 18-month period, providing mentorship, access to experts, and other resources to enable them succeed. This was launched by Flourish Ventures. So Flourish Ventures is a global VC firm focused primarily on fintech, but we did see a need in the startup ecosystem, especially in Africa, where a lot of the funding, in essence, goes to male-founded startups. So over the last couple of years, about 93% of all of the funding that has come into Africa from a VC standpoint has gone to male-founded startups. A lot of that funding also goes literally just 4 cities. So Lagos, Nairobi, Cape Town, Cairo get sort of the lion's share of investment VC funding in Africa. So I've talked about the gender standpoint. I've talked about the sector standpoint. Fintech also gets the lion's share. And to a large extent as well, a lot of the funding literally goes to founders who very likely schooled abroad.
Okay.
We saw a gap in the sense that, yes, everyone does agree that funding in Africa is on the rise and it's booming in certain ways, but it's still not very diverse, right?
Okay.
It's literally going to a small group of founders who are male, building fintech solutions in the 4 cities that I mentioned and who likely schooled abroad, right? And we think that there is an opportunity to diversify that. And this is important because we also believe that diversifying that will mean growing the amount of funding that's coming into the African ecosystem overall. Just for a bit of context, all of the funding that was raised in Africa last year is just about 1.3% of global VC funding. So we still have a long way to go and there's a massive opportunity. But if we're just focused on, one small group of founders, then it will take much more. So the goal of this program really is to go beyond these niche and to include other sectors, include other geographies, include other genders for sure, but also prioritizing founders who may not have, the visible signals of pedigree that global investors may be looking for, simply because if you schooled abroad, right, you have things in common with those investors. So we're looking at founders who are local, who may not, because of their background or because of their sectors or because of their location, may not have access to VC funding. The goal of this program is essentially to find these founders, first of all, right? Invest enough cash for them to be able to keep running over the next 12 to 18 months, but then provide as much support that hopefully makes up for what might be missing, whether in their specific ecosystems or resources that are critical to them scaling their businesses. And then a big part of this is also then connecting them to other global investors who can then invest in their follow-on rounds. That's kind of what we're set up to do. And I guess the overarching goal that if we do this for a large enough pool of founders over the next 3 years, right, it hopefully starts to send a signal to other investors that, hey, maybe you need to start thinking about investing differently across all of these different spaces, across all of these different sectors. And hopefully that plays a significant role in how funding is then diversified across the continent. So that's, broadly speaking, what we're set up to achieve.
Thank you for that, Emmanuel. So you've detailed the funding nuances, the gaps and the opportunities of the African startup space and how Madika ties into that. So you've been involved in the African startup space for many years yourself. You've previously worked for organizations such as Zandela, Venture Garden Group, Flourish Ventures. You've given us an insight into how things look now. So how have things evolved since you first got involved in the space?
That's a really good question. I think in a lot of ways, my career trajectory has actually kind of followed the growth of definitely the Nigerian startup ecosystem, but also to a large extent, the African ecosystem, broadly speaking. So when I moved into tech about 9 years ago now, it was around the time when there weren't a lot of visibly successful founders, right? And access to knowledge was the biggest of challenges. And that was what motivated me actually to then start to build entrepreneurship community. So I signed up to become co-director for Startup Grind in Lagos, which Startup Grind is a community of entrepreneurs. And I started organizing fireside chats with some of the more successful entrepreneurs and just asking questions and just trying to uncover, how did you get to this point? How did you raise funding? How did you solve these specific issues on your journey? So in the early days, it was access to knowledge. I think 1 or 2 years afterwards, it became clear that, okay, I mean, the knowledge is becoming a bit more available, but then where are the investors? On the one hand, angel investing was also still kind of new. There weren't a lot of active angel investors in that sense. But even the investors that were in the ecosystem, the dominant narrative around the time was, there are not enough investable startups. But if you do speak to startups, they will tell you that they don't understand what investors are looking for. Like, I'm here, like, why are you not investing, right?
Very true.
So that also kind of then motivated some of the work that I was doing then to say, hey, how do we create platforms where investors and entrepreneurs can essentially like speak the same language and just like bridge that gap? So, and a couple of friends came together and launched a platform called Ventures Dialogue, and it was set up to do that. We're organizing masterclasses on term sheets, organizing like events with entrepreneurs and investors in the same room, that sort of thing. I think fast forward a couple more years, the focus then kind of shifted to the regulatory landscape. So governments now started paying some attention. Some startups have started raising significant amounts of funding, and governments have now started paying attention to say, hey, okay, there's something happening here. How do we axe it? Right? So how do we help in quotes, right? But
Yes.
We know that sometimes those help might be disruptive sometimes. And I think, and in a lot of ways, even those who have good intentions and really want to help don't fully understand. I mean, government stakeholders, right? Don't fully understand how to catalyze startup ecosystems. And because a lot of times what governments tend to do is top down. So they just want to come in and solve all the problems, right? But that's not the way to do it. It's, listening, understanding, and involving these guys, and essentially just being a platform to catalyze what's already there, right? Rather than go in and try to solve the real problems, right? So my focus also then kind of shifted to, okay, how do we engage policymakers? So I did a bit of work just like doing policy research. I spent most of 2021 at a UK think tank, just doing like research. And for me, it was just to understand a bit better how to speak the language of policymakers. But I was also actively involved in the Nigeria Startup Act, just like pushing and advocating for that. But generally speaking, you can see that there's been a trend towards like startup acts on the continent, engaging with policymakers, creating platforms for startup government partnerships, which I think is really important. And then I think while that's ongoing, maybe the one other trend that I want to put out there is that as companies also begin to mature, you then start to see governance issues, because in the early days, nobody really cared about that stuff. And the goal was just to build, right? But as companies begin to mature, it's then like, hey, that thing that you didn't pay attention to 3 or 4 years ago is now coming to bite you, right? And I think that we're at a point now where there is like heightened awareness and focus on, on the fundamentals of just like corporate governance and all of those things that will ensure longevity. So that's kind of, I guess, my summary of what the trends have been. Obviously, there have been a lot more funding coming into the African ecosystem. Obviously, there's a lot more global knowledge around like what it takes to build startups and all. I think there's still a lot more work to be done in terms of localizing this content, but that's kind of my view of how the ecosystems have evolved over the past couple of years.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Emmanuel. So you mentioned that your career trajectory has mirrored the growth of Nigeria's startup space. So would you say that the evolution of the startup space has influenced the work that you're doing in Madica in terms of empowering entrepreneurs with the provision of funding and also democratizing access to world-class company building support?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess picking up from what I was sharing earlier, now we're at the point where everyone agrees that there's a lot more funding coming into Africa, right?
Yes.
But there is still a gap, which I called out earlier, right? Most of that funding is still focused on a small group. And what Madica aims to do is to then hopefully broaden that a bit more. So we were very focused on underrepresented founders, underrepresented sectors in underrepresented geographies. And how do we ensure that we're finding the best founders in those places? And how do we ensure that we're providing them with as much support to enable them scale? I think a big part of this is also figuring out how can we then also extend the resources that to be frank, we would probably be able to invest directly in maybe 30 startups over the next 3 years, right?
Awesome.
But we do have an opportunity to go beyond that, to extend resources from this program to other startups who may not necessarily benefit from direct investment in that sense. So we're actively thinking also about, yes, we have this venture building curriculum and programs that we would take the companies that we invest in through, but how do we also ensure that we're able to extend those to others within the African ecosystem, broadly speaking, in a way that, as I mentioned earlier, yes, there's a lot of information out there about building startups, but our hope is to also localize that a bit more and focus more on the African context and hopefully extend that to others, whether or not they benefit from direct investment in Medica.
Awesome. So you've detailed a few times that funding in the, Nigeria and wider African startup space seems to be centralized around the 4 big markets, Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, and South Africa, and also centralized around some key players in the space. So from your perspective, what is the potential positive impact of decentralizing funding in Africa's startup space?
I think in the short answer is that it hopefully broadens or increases the size of the pie. Like I mentioned earlier, all of the funding in Africa, VC funding in Africa last year is about 1.3% of global VC flows.
Yes.
And this is despite the fact that last year it wasn't the best of years, globally speaking. Our hope is that if we're able to show that it's actually possible to find and fund startups anywhere across the continent, hopefully other global investors start to then think about those spaces a little differently, because we think that there is a perception of risk that exists today that, hey, like it's not exactly easy to, maybe go into Addis Ababa or going to whatever city on the continent. And there are a lot of cities across the continent that aren't getting their fair share of funding, right?
Yeah.
And there is that perception of risk. Our hope is that if we're able to show that, hey, it's actually possible to invest in these spaces and there are startups ready for funding in those spaces, hopefully investors who may not have as much, boots on the ground like we do would then start to think about how best they can actually invest. Our hope is that, we change that perception of risk, but by democratizing, by showing that it's possible. And then that has the ripple effect of potentially then changing how people think about investing in those spaces. And then ultimately it grows the pool of capital that's coming into the African ecosystem. Does that make sense?
Yes, 100%. Fantastic. You've outlined the potential positives of decentralizing funding in Africa's space and slightly touched on risks and perceptions. So from your experience, what are the challenges that you've experienced when it comes to decentralizing funding in Africa's startup space, or maybe particular in Nigeria?
Maybe one thing that I would say, first of all, is to also just share that when we talk about investing in, say, Nigeria as an example, we're really just talking about investing in Lagos.
Yes.
So the same challenge that exists across Africa also still exists even in Nigeria as a country.
Very true.
Because there are startups operating in, say, Aba, or operating in Port Harcourt or Kaduna or wherever else in Nigeria that get disproportionately low funding compared to Lagos.
Very good point.
Right. So that challenge does exist. So I think that's the first thing that I would say. But I think maybe bringing this back to the African context as well, I think that it takes a lot of work to, spend time in these places, understand the context, or at the very least, build relationships with people who understand that context a lot more than you probably do, to be able to get a sense of what works, what doesn't work, who are the right players, where should we be looking, who should we be speaking to, and what are the risks. And I think that is a lot of work, which a lot of global investors may not have the capacity to be able to do, honestly speaking. And that's kind of where we come in, where it's like, hey, yes, we're a global firm, but we are also local. And we have the capacity to build all of these networks and build all of these relationships. And I think that's kind of what sets us apart in that sense, where it's like, hey, we want to show that it's possible, and we're leveraging our relationships on the ground and our presence on the ground to be able to do that work. Hopefully to show again that this is possible. And then people then start to say, hey, okay, maybe here's a way to do it, and here's a path that we can also take, or here's how we can replicate this model in a way that works for us and things like that. But those are the challenges, but I think that they can be overcome.
I like the point that you made about centralizing of funding is not just constrained to country, but there is also centralizing in country by region. With that in mind, do you believe that we are missing out on some great talent and untapped entrepreneurs by not looking outside of our, I guess, immediate locality?
Absolutely. Like, I have no doubt about that. I think that there are amazing entrepreneurs across the continent. I guess the one thing that I would add to this is local talents, local entrepreneurs are best positioned to solve their own challenges, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Right. Because they've experienced these challenges firsthand. They know the context, they know the people, and they are rooted and grounded in those spaces. So they're the best set of people to build solutions there. So if we're not funding them, I think that we're missing out on a lot. Yes.
Yes, I agree. So can you tell us about some of the, say, untapped entrepreneurs that you've discovered through your program and the work that you're doing?
We launched Madika late in October last year. Yes. We are in the process of now making our first investments. I sadly won't be able to go into specifics of who they are, where they are, but
no problem.
We're hoping to make our first investments before the end of this quarter, by which time we'll be able to publicly announce some of the entrepreneurs that we've been engaging with, if that's okay.
No, that's perfect. I understand, but I look forward to receiving some updates once you're available to share.
By all means.
So you mentioned that you're in the process of making your first investments. So I guess what do you look for in a startup when deciding to invest in them?
Yeah, I think selection criteria, first of all, we're prioritizing local founders with diverse teams. So ideally, it's a woman leading the team, but ideally, at the very least, they have a female co-founder. Well, at least there's some diversity in the team. We also prioritize ventures with at least a minimum viable product.
Yes.
Right. And with ideally their first few paying customers. And I think this point is really important, because I think the discipline of just like focusing on what people are willing to pay for, whether or not you have your product fully built out, I think is really important. And I think it's important that African founders especially like prioritize that discipline. We are also prioritizing ventures that haven't yet raised significant institutional capital. Going back to the thesis that I shared earlier, if they can already access a lot of significant global capital, then maybe Madika isn't the best fit for them. Yeah, we're also looking at founders from across all sectors, as long as they're building real scalable solutions. That's kind of our selection criteria in a nutshell.
Fantastic. So you've detailed what you look for in ventures before making an investment, also the stages and their development that you look at. And I think earlier on, you touched on the value or the amount that you typically invest in a startup. I'm not sure if you'd like to kind of go into more detail regarding that.
So if I were to sum up, I guess the value that Madika brings to the founders that we support, first is access to funding. So we invest up to $200,000, which is enough capital to meet some of their growth objectives. But typically, this might also be part of a slightly larger round for these founders over the next rounds for the next 12 to 18 months, that sort of thing. But we also then provide them access to community, which is a network of mentors, experts, peers, coaches who can provide tailored hands-on support. And like I said, we work with these founders for a 12 to 18 months period, and we provide personalized company building support through workshops, through immersion trips to much more advanced ecosystems, and just helping them build the relationships and the networks that they might be lacking. We also provide them access to tools, credits, discounts for some of the platforms that they use. A critical part of this is also introductions to investors, and continued access to Madica's community. So we work with them essentially to raise their next round through curated access to investors and other programs that might be relevant for their journey. And we believe that all of this put together addressing most of the critical needs of these founders at this stage, especially those who might otherwise not have access to these kinds of supports in the ecosystems that they're operating in.
Thank you for that, Emmanuel. So you've detailed, I guess, what makes you unique to other funders and what value you add to startups that you fund. From a startup or founder perspective, what tips would you give to untapped entrepreneurs so that they can better position themselves to access some of this world-class company building support available?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to just apply if and when they feel ready. So we run an open application process. You don't necessarily need an intro to anyone on the team. Anyone can simply just go to www.madica.com.vc/apply and they can apply directly to the program. So I guess first advice is don't wait, and you don't necessarily need an intro. You can always reach us directly. I think the other thing that I would say is that emphasis on focusing on what people are willing to pay for. In my career, I've worked with a lot of engineers, and one thing that engineers typically want to do is to build, right? And that's great. But I think that an important muscle to also just like keep in mind is building what people want and building what people are willing to pay for, because otherwise you don't have a business. So regardless of whether or not you have your product fully built out, I think prioritizing what's the problem that I'm trying to solve and who is it that I'm trying to solve this problem for, and validating that with them to understand that, is this solving your problem? And is this something that you're willing to pay for? Not just getting them to say, oh, like, I will pay for this, but actually getting them to open up their wallets to pay for something.
Yes.
I think it's an important discipline that founders need early on. And then doing the work upfront to figure out, is there a large enough pool of people like this who would be willing to pay for this solution? Because it's not just enough to get one person. I mean, you can always get your family members to buy or pay for your solution, right?
Yes.
But is there a large enough pool of people with this problem who are willing to pay for my solution? I think that it then starts to get really interesting at that point. So I guess that would be my top tip for founders.
You've given us great insight into the value that you add and the work that you do at Madica. I'm assuming to achieve this, it requires a strong network and local partners. So give us some insights into how you've gone about building your network and leveraging that local knowledge.
That's a really useful question. So we were very deliberate, for instance, to launch around the AfriLabs annual gathering in October of last year. AfriLabs, for those who might not know, is a network of hubs across the continent. I think right now they're probably at like 400 hubs across the continent, across 52, maybe all countries on the continent now. And that was really important to us because, like I mentioned earlier, we might know some specific context like really well, but there are people who are embedded across the continent who are committed like us to building those local ecosystems, but they've been doing this much longer than we have. So launching within that gathering and prioritizing relationships with hubs and incubators and accelerators across all of the countries on the continent, I think is an important part of what we do and will continue to do, because working with these local partners on the ground, we then start to understand the context a bit more. We start to understand what the challenges are. We start to understand who the startups are, right, that we need to be engaging with. So that's the big part of what we do. I think similarly, ABAN is also another organization that we're engaging with actively. ABAN is the African Business Angels Network. Angel networks are also very critical to building local ecosystems and just understanding what's happening on the ground. So, but beyond that, we also then do the work of engaging directly as well. So last year, for instance, I spent a bit of time in Accra, just meeting founders directly. We would continue to do that. Lusaka as well, we did meet a few founders there as well. we'll continue to do that and just like go into those spaces and engage directly with entrepreneurs. And again, the hope is that we want to be as accessible as possible. We want to understand the context as much as possible. And like I said earlier, for founders in places, if for whatever reason we've not been able to reach them directly, they can always just go to the website and apply, and they don't need to wait in that sense. But that's kind of how we approach building the networks across the continent.
Awesome. So you've detailed the importance of partnerships and also highlighted some of the interesting partnerships that you have and how that shapes the work that you currently do and will probably be doing in the future. If we look in terms of the future, the trends, what you're doing, what trends in Nigeria or Africa's startup landscape are you currently excited about?
Good question. I think a couple of them. One is that more investors are starting to pay attention to funding women founders.
Yes.
Right. I think this is a really, really important point because, like I mentioned earlier, 93% of the funding that has come into Africa has been to male-founded companies. And I think that there is a missed opportunity there if we're not prioritizing women founders. And it's exciting to see funds that are specifically dedicated to women founders, for instance. Google also recently announced a Women Founders Accelerator program that's actually currently open. So all of that is great. And I think it's a very welcome trend. I think the rise of angel networks across the continent is also an important one. There is definitely still a lot of room for growth, but I believe ABAN, which is the African Business Angel Network that I mentioned earlier, as an angel network in, if I'm not mistaken, almost all African countries now. And local capital is critical to growing those ecosystems. So yes, those networks might still be nascent, they might still be new, but going back to what I said about Lagos a couple of years ago, with sustained efforts, it starts to send a signal to other investors that, hey, local investors are willing to put down their own funding. And that partnership between like global and local capital, I think is really important to growing ecosystems going forward. I think the one other trend that I'm excited about is generally the rise of startup acts across the continent. I think a lot more countries are starting to pay attention to, how do we create an enabling environment using legislation in that sense? And I think it's a useful, very helpful trend. I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done, but yes, I'm just seeing that there's a lot more interest from governments to prioritize that, I think is important.
Thank you for that. You shared some great insights in terms of the trends that you're currently excited about in Africa's startup landscape. So if we look further ahead, look into the future of Africa, where do you see Nigeria in 5 years' time, or even Africa in 5 years' time from a pre-seed startup investment perspective?
Good question. I think I would want to double click a bit more on that Startup Acts conversation, not necessarily just because of the Startup Acts per se, but broadly speaking, my hope is that there is a lot more collaboration between governments and startups. So yes, the rise of Startup Acts is a great step, but I think that there's still a lot of significant room for growth in startup and government partnerships. And the reason why I say that is, I mean, as you know, there are massive infrastructure gaps across the continent. And a lot of the times, a lot of the startups that we actually see on the continent are doing work to plug those gaps. So I believe startups have a critical role to play in economic development on the continent going forward. I think more government stakeholders need to realize that and then learn how to engage with startups and partner with them, because to a large extent, we're all on the same team. We're all working towards the same goal. And my hope is that in 5 years' time, there is a lot more collaboration between startups and government stakeholders, not in a top-down, this is what we expect from you, or this is how we intend to help, but in a almost bottoms-up, hey, there's something happening in this space. How can we be of help? What's needed? How can governments, catalyze that? How can government leverage their convening power to, attract more funding? How can they, create platforms for simple things like startups bidding for government projects. How can government essentially leverage their powers to ensure that startups do succeed? Because like I said, doing that would mean, in a sense, fast tracking our path towards infrastructure development, in a sense, because while I think that we do need BRTs and high-speed trains and, a lot of massive infrastructure projects, those things will take time. But there are startups on the ground right now that are doing critical work to just address informality in some ways, and in a sense, digitizing some of those work and, organizing what is largely chaotic now. And I think recognizing the role that these startups play, while still keeping in mind that, yes, we would build those massive infrastructure, but working together towards that, I think is critical. And that's what I hope to see in 5 years' time. I know this isn't exactly a pre-seed investment point, which is your question, but I do think that if there's a lot of focus on how do we ensure that a lot of these early stage startups do succeed, then it leads to everything that I've shared. Because one more point that I should probably call out, which is really important, is the startups that survive the pre-seed stage and end up making it to scale are the ones who actually have the most potential to create jobs across the continent.
Yes.
And there's a lot of research that backs that up, right? So it's really critical to see them, to nurture them at those early stages, because if they do succeed, they would solve some of these challenges, but also create a ton of jobs that Africa does need.
Yes.
Right. So that's my hope.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for that. Great insight. I too hope to see more collaboration between startups and governments in Africa. So
Nice.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Emmanuel. So I guess if we look closer to home, where do you see yourself, Madika, in 5 years' time?
I mean, personally speaking, I've always been and I would continue to remain committed to Africa's development and supporting entrepreneurs with whatever it is that I do. And I think my work would likely continue to be at the intersection of African development, entrepreneurship, technology going forward. And bringing this to Madika, my hope is that with Madika, we would have made a significant dent in how funding is made into Africa, especially in places where there's been historical underrepresentation. So in 5 years, I really hope that the narrative that I shared earlier around that perception of risk has changed a lot. I really hope that there's a lot more funding going to women founders. I really hope that there's a lot more funding going to geographies and sectors that are still underrepresented. And my hope is that Madika plays a significant role in that.
Awesome. Great vision. I believe that you'll achieve big things. And I'm looking forward to keeping in touch and seeing how things progress, because it's a very unique problem that you're trying to solve. And I think you're in a great position to solve it.
Thank you.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging and when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
That is a really interesting question.
Fantastic.
I mean, the only one that comes to mind, I do like music a lot. So there's a quote from a song that has stayed with me for a really long time. It simply says, you can be a dreamer, but don't live in your bed.
Oh, brilliant.
Right. And I think that's an important point, both for me and I think everyone else on the continent. Personally, I like to dream. I like to imagine what's possible. And a lot of times, like entrepreneurs like me are very optimistic and like we start to think about possibilities, right?
Yes.
But I think it's always important to match that with action as well.
Yes.
Right. And that's why I believe this quote has stayed with me a lot. So yes to possibilities, yes to dreams, yes to, imagine what can be, but we all need to put in the work to make that become a reality.
Fantastic. I love that. Thank you for sharing it. As we're coming to the end of today's conversation, I was wondering, do you have any closing remarks, final calls to action for people who are interested in the work that you do? Do you might want to find out a bit more information?
Yeah, I mean, good points. I think for entrepreneurs who might be interested in Madika, the website is www.madika.vc. And we do encourage you to apply, and we're looking forward to reading your applications and engaging. We're also always on the lookout for partners and collaborators in the work that we do. We have a number of forms on the website, or you can just send us an email as well at hello@medica.vc. Someone on the team would definitely be in touch. Otherwise, I think the one thing that I would just say is, I guess on a final note to entrepreneurs, is the work that you all do keeps me inspired, and it's just to keep doing what you do, right? Because I do honestly believe that entrepreneurs have a significant role to play in shaping Africa's trajectory. And I'm always just inspired by anyone who throws their hat in the ring and says, hey, you know what, I'm going to be a part of solving Africa's challenges. So keep doing what you do. And thank you very much.
Awesome. That was a fantastic way to close today's conversation. It has been a great conversation. It's been a privilege having you on the podcast today, Emmanuel, especially at the early stages of Medica. So looking forward to seeing how things progress. And I hope that many more untapped entrepreneurs make themselves known and reach out to you and your team. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Tessa. It was great being on the podcast today. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emmanuel. And we will speak soon. Keep in touch.
You too. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.